As most famously presented by William Paley in his theological work titled Natural Theology, the watchmaker analogy is a recurring argument for a designer, which, by way of analogy, asserts that complexity requires a designer. The way Paley put it is essentially as follows. If you were walking across a field and saw a watch lying upon the ground, you wouldn't assume that it had come together by chance because it is too ordered and complicated. Rather, you would assume that it had a conscious and intelligent designer. By way of analogy, Paley then went on to argue that because life, and indeed the universe, is ordered and complicated, it too must have had a conscious and intelligent designer. While Paley's presentation of this argument is the most famous, since his time many theists and deists have developed versions of their own. For example, Ray Comfort often uses the analogy of a painting and a painter, while Ian Duby is fond of using the analogy of a building and a builder. However, despite the many versions of this argument, they are all fundamentally the same. They assert that complexity requires a designer. So what exactly is wrong with this argument? I mean, the title of this video promises to debunk it, and yet we're a minute in and we haven't even started. So, beginning with its most critical flaws, let's get on with it. First and foremost, and what single-handedly debunks the watchmaker argument, is that it's a false analogy. An analogy is a comparison between things that have similar features for the purpose of explaining a principle or an idea. And in this case, Paley insists that a comparison can be made between the complexity of a watch and the complexity of the universe, which both imply that they had a designer. However, the last step is flawed because it concludes that because two things share one quality in common, that being complexity, they must also share another quality in common, a designer, when this simply cannot be logically concluded. If it could, then by using the same faulty logic, countless other absurd qualities could be attributed to the universe. For example, the watch is complex, the watch was invented in the 15th century. The universe is complex, therefore the universe was invented in the 15th century. Just because two objects share one quality in common, this doesn't necessarily mean that they share another. Hence, right from the get-go, the watchmaker argument is a false analogy. A second objection, and one very closely related to the first, is that it commits a false cause fallacy. It does this by asserting that complexity and order can only be caused by a designer, when not only has this never been proven to be true, it has actually been proven to be completely incorrect. But we'll get to evolution in just a second. Essentially, like all false cause fallacies, the watchmaker argument mistakenly confuses correlation with causation. It recognises a relationship between complexity and designers, and then concludes that one necessarily implies the other. To once again demonstrate this flaw through an unrelated example, we can take a look at the following. Temperatures have been rising over the past few centuries, whilst at the same time the number of pirates have been decreasing. Thus, pirates call the world and global warming is a hoax. There may be a correlation between temperatures and pirates, just as there is a correlation between complexity and designers, but this doesn't necessarily mean that one implies the other. And this brings us comfortably to yet another major problem with the watchmaker argument. It completely ignores evolution by natural selection. Without getting into it too deeply, natural selection has been completely and utterly proven to be an unconscious process that has given rise to countless complex and purposed organisms, which, without an understanding of natural selection, do indeed give the impression that they were deliberately designed. Or in other words, we know for a fact that nature can, does, and has produced remarkably complex organisms without a conscious and intelligent hand behind it. The truth of the matter is that the reason we recognise a watch as designed actually has nothing to do with how complex and purposed it is, but rather it is because we already know that the watch was designed. We have literally millions of examples of watches being created by a designer, and 0 examples of watches being made without a designer. However, and in contrast, we have 0 examples of life being created by a designer, and literally millions of examples of nature creating complex life. A fourth major flaw with the watchmaker argument is that it either commits a special pleading fallacy, or that it's completely self-refuting. Its core premise asserts that purpose and complexity requires a designer, and so if we draw the watchmaker argument out to its logical conclusion, that there is a God and that it created the universe and everything in it, then by applying the argument's logic to itself, we must conclude that that God too had a designer, and so on and so forth for infinity. By definition, special pleading is an argument in which the speaker deliberately creates an exception to their argument without justifying why, and that is precisely what one must do to prevent the watchmaker argument from being completely self-refuting. Hence, the watchmaker argument is either self-refuting or it commits a special pleading fallacy. Despite the fact that each of the previous 4 objections single-handedly defeat the watchmaker argument on their own, here are just some additional issues to add insult to injury. The watchmaker argument is self-contradicting. The argument first assumes that a watch is different from nature, which it indirectly claims is uncomplicated and random. However, it then states that since the universe is so complicated and ordered, it too must have had a creator. Thus, it gives the universe 2 incompatible and contradicting qualities. The watchmaker argument doesn't imply a designer, it implies that there are many designers. After finding that watch upon the ground, imagine if you then saw beside it a shoe. Would you assume that a watchmaker made that shoe? Of course not, you would assume that a shoemaker made it. Therefore, according to the analogy, life must have a life maker, suns must have a sun maker, and so on and so forth, implying that there are many creators rather than just one. Of course, one creator could be responsible for creating more than one thing, but until demonstrated, that is still just an assumption. The watchmaker argument acts as if a watchmaker creates a watch from nothing, when this simply isn't true. A watch, like all human creations, is a rearrangement of energy and matter that already existed. A watchmaker can't create a watch literally from nothing, and so the watchmaker argument can actually only argue that the designer of the universe rearranged energy and matter that already existed. The watchmaker argument doesn't support theism. Even if it were accepted to be a sound argument, it would only prove that the universe had a universe designer, and that's it. It wouldn't prove a particular religion to be true, or, as Hitchens put it, even if the watchmaker argument was valid, you, as a theist, still have all of your work ahead of you. In addition to the watchmaker argument not supporting theism, its logic is also inconsistent with the description of most monotheistic gods, and certainly the Abrahamic ones. An all-powerful and all-loving God would not create organisms with the type of suboptimal design that can be seen in nature. From vestigial organs to birth defects to pregnancy complications, it cannot logically follow that an all-powerful, all-loving God can be responsible for this. Meaning that if the watchmaker argument was valid, this would mean that the God that created the universe is either not omnipotent or not omnibenevolent, or both. So, to recap, the watchmaker argument is flawed because it's a false analogy, it commits a false cause fallacy, it completely ignores evolution by natural selection, it commits a special pleading fallacy, or it's completely self-refuting, it's self-contradicting, it doesn't imply a designer, but rather many designers, it acts as if watches are created from nothing, it doesn't support theism, and it doesn't support the concept of an omnipotent and omnibenevolent God. It's not a sound argument. In fact, it's thoroughly debunked. As you might have noticed, this video is quite a bit longer than many of my others, but to be perfectly honest with you, I think it needed to be. While the watchmaker argument is thoroughly flawed, it is nevertheless what I personally consider to be one of the best arguments for a deity that has ever been, and hence, it deserved this royal kick-in. Thanks for the view, and I'll leave you with this overwhelmingly powerful argument to consider. Armoured Skeptic has a YouTube channel. Armoured Skeptic has 300,000 subscribers. Rationality Rules has a YouTube channel. Therefore, Rationality Rules has 300,000 subscribers.